Hello, welcome to Post Colonial Space. I'm Masood Raja, and today I'll continue my conversation about Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed. We are on the fourth and final chapter. I've already covered what he's discussing in this chapter. Primarily, what he's discussing is the strategies used by the anti-dialogical forces, the oppressor group, to contain the people. And then he will articulate towards the end of the chapter the counter strategies that any movement must use. Now, he explains these strategies under the registers of conquest, which I've already covered, divide and rule. I've already covered part of it in my previous video where we covered how community development and leadership training is used to incorporate the people into the project of power. And today I will cover the rest of the section on divide and rule. And the third strategy used by the oppressor group is what he calls manipulation, and we'll come to that in another video. And the final one is cultural invasion. And then towards the end of the chapter, in the culminating part of the book, Freire would lay out for us the counter strategies. So as always, let us first read, and I must warn you it's a slightly longer reading, but let's wade through it, read, and then I'll come back and talk about it. So here we go. Class conflict is another concept which upsets the oppressors, since they do not wish to consider themselves an oppressive class. Unable to deny, try as they may, the existence of social classes, they preach the need for understanding and harmony between those who buy and those who are obliged to sell their labor. However, the unconcealable antagonism which exists between the two classes makes this harmony impossible. The elite call for harmony between classes as if classes were fortuitous agglomerations of individuals curiously looking at a shop window on a Sunday afternoon. The only harmony which is viable and demonstrable is that found among the oppressors themselves. Although they may diverge and upon occasion even clash over group interests, they unite immediately at a threat to the class. Similarly, the harmony of the oppressed is only possible when its members are engaged in the struggle for liberation. Only in exceptional cases is it not only possible but necessary for both classes to unite and act in harmony. But when the emergency which united them has passed, they will return to the contradiction which defines their existence and which never really disappeared. All the actions of the dominant class manifest its need to divide in order to facilitate the preservation of the oppressor's state. Its interference in the unions favoring certain representatives of the dominated classes, who actually represent the oppressor, not their own comrades, its promotion of individuals who reveal leadership capacity and could signify a threat if they were not softened up in this way, its distribution of benefits to some and penalties to others. All these are ways of dividing in order to preserve the system which favors the elite. They are forms of actions which exploit directly or indirectly one of the weak points of the oppressed, their basic insecurity. The oppressed are insecure in their duality as beings which house the oppressor. On the one hand, they resist her or him. On the other hand, at a certain stage in their relationship, they are attracted by him or her. Under these circumstances, the oppressors easily obtain positive results from divisive action. In addition, the oppressed know from experience the price of not accepting an invitation offered with the purpose of preventing their unity as a class. Losing their jobs and finding their names on a blacklist signifying closed doors to other jobs is the least that can happen. Their basic insecurity is thus directly linked to the enslavement of their labor, which really implies the enslavement of their person, as Bishop Split emphasized. People are fulfilled only to the extent that they create their world, which is a human world, and create it with their transforming labor. The fulfillment of humankind as human beings lies then in the fulfillment of the world. If for a person to be in the world of work is to be totally dependent, insecure, and permanently threatened, if their work does not belong to them, the person cannot be fulfilled. Work that is not free ceases to be a fulfilling pursuit and becomes an effective means of dehumanization. Every move by the oppressed towards unity points towards other actions. It means that sooner or later the oppressed will perceive their state of depersonalization and discover that as long as they are divided, they will always be easy prey for manipulation and domination. Unity and organization can enable them to change their weakness into a transforming force with which they can recreate the world and make it more human. The more human world to which they justly aspire, however, is the antithesis of the human world of the oppressors, a world which is the exclusive possession of the oppressors, who preach an impossible harmony between themselves, who dehumanize, and the oppressed, who are dehumanized. Since oppressors and oppressed are antithetical, what serves the interests of one group disserves the interests of the others. Dividing in order to preserve the status quo then is necessarily a fundamental objective of the theory of anti-dialogical action. In addition, the dominators try to present themselves as saviors of the women and men they dehumanize and divide. This messianism however, cannot conceal their true intention. To save themselves, they want to save their riches, their power, their way of life, the things that enable them to subjugate others. Their mistake is that men cannot save themselves. They save themselves, no matter how one understands salvation, either as individuals or as an oppressor class. Salvation can be achieved only with others. To the extent, however, that the elites oppress, they cannot be with the oppressed, for being against them is the essence of oppression. A psychoanalysis of oppressive action might reveal the false generosity of the oppressor, described in Chapter 1 as a dimension of the latter's sense of guilt. With this false generosity, he attempts not only to preserve an unjust and necrophilic order, but to buy peace for himself. It happens that peace cannot be bought. Peace is experienced in solidarity and loving acts, which cannot be incarnated in oppression. Hence, the messianic element of the theory of anti-dialogical action reinforces the first characteristic of this action, the necessity for conquest. Since it is necessary to divide the people in order to preserve the status quo and thereby the power of the dominators, it is essential for the oppressors to keep the oppressed from perceiving their strategy. So the former must convince the latter that they are being defended against the demonic action of marginals, rowdies, and enemies of God, for these are the epithets directed at men who lived and are living the brave pursuit of man's humanization. In order to divide and confuse the people, the destroyers call themselves builders and accuse the true builders of being destructive. History, however, always takes it upon itself to modify these designations. Today, although the official terminology continues to call Tiradentes a conspirator in confidente, and the liberation movement which he led a conspiracy, the national hero is not the man who called Tiradentes, a bandit, ordered him hanged and quartered, and had pieces of the bloody corpse strewn through the streets of the neighboring villages an example. It is Tiradentes who is the hero. History tore up the title given him by the elites and recognized his action for what it was. It is the man who in their own time sought unity for liberation, who are the heroes, men, not those who use their power to divide and rule. So the first thing that Freire is challenging in what I just read is a critique of sloganeering or attempts at promoting harmony, right? And we all see it as a neutral term or maybe as a neutral practice. But what he's saying is that when the dominant group and their affiliates talk about class harmony, right? What they're basically talking about is the status quo, right? Because harmony is not going to change the lives of those who sell their labor and those who purchase it. Now, on a different note, I had discussed this in my book on Talibanization of America, where I was talking about self-interest, right? Because in a lot of conservative economic circles and in political circles, self-interest is offered as universal. Right, so that means that if everyone is following their self-interest, we will create a harmonious, beautiful world. But self-interest is connected to one's class and one's cultural identity. So a worker's self-interest, for example, is to extract more money for their labor. Right? A capitalist's self-interest is to extract more labor for less money. So if harmony is used as a leading principle by those in the dominant group, then cultural or political harmony will end up stabilizing the very structure in which we exist. So that is one way in which the oppressor group or the dominant group can still keep people divided. Because here is what happens if we buy into this idea that we should not disturb the peace, the status quo, then you can shave off people from amongst the people who are agitating for their rights in the name of harmony, right? And keep them fractured and not let them unite. So that's what he's offering as a critique of harmony. And but throughout, there are terms that he's repeating here. False generosity. We have encountered this term in chapter 1, right? That these messages of harmony and peace are offered under false generosity, false charity, charity that doesn't change the world, but just has cosmetic effects. Now, this is also done through people who attain leadership positions amongst the people, and then their interest gets connected with the power, right? And they take it upon themselves to speak for the people. And so there is a need that we should be wary about that, right? And we should understand that people who somehow claim leadership, their interests can no longer sometimes be aligned with the people that they represent. If you have worked in academia or any other organization, you can see that already happening. People could be promoted from amongst the ranks to middle management, and suddenly they start speaking the language of power, right? And they forget that their job was to represent the people. So the lesson for us is that even if we are incorporated within the logic of power itself, we should never forget, or revolutionary leaders will never forget, that it's the people that they represent, right? In whose name they have been elected or selected. Then there is a reference to, and I think I misspelled it in my reading, right? And that is Tiradentes, right? And what he's trying to, Tiradentes was a 17th century revolutionary leader against the Portuguese in Brazil, who was, of course, prosecuted for his acts. And at that time when he was prosecuted, he was supposed to be the criminal, right? And the governor general who prosecutes him is the one who is the hero of history. But what he's saying is these things shift because history is not fixed. Now in the national narratives of Brazil, Tridentius is the hero and not the Governor General. So we ought to keep that in mind as we deal with power. Because history will remember who is on the right side, who was on the right side. And then overall, this section on divide and rule, what it teaches us, and as we read, is that power or the dominant group, one way that they keep us divided or keep us controlled is by dividing us. They can divide us through false promises of community development, right? It's like, we are going to develop your community, we'll bring jobs here, and you internalize that, right? And then you don't want to push the envelope, you don't want to disturb the status quo, right? Or they can raise certain people from the community as leaders and then manipulate them, and they further go on and start working against the interest of their own people. And then false promises of harmony or peaceful change, right, which don't change anything, right, but maintain the status quo. So what we learn from this entire section is that divide and rule isn't just strong, we are going to divide the people. It works in subtle ways. Education plays a role in it. Jobs play a role in it. Upward mobility plays a role in it. And in any given context, for example, in United States, race can be used to divide people. Ethnicities can be used to divide people. If you're in India and Pakistan, religion can be used to keep people divided. Unity will only happen when people know how are they being divided, when they learn from each other how they are being divided, and despite their differences, while retaining their own identities, they come together against an oppressive order, right? So that's the lesson that he's trying to draw here. But right now, we're in that part of the book where he's highlighting what are the four strategies that the dominant groups use to keep the people where they are, which what he calls the anti-dialogical way of thinking and practice and theory, against which he has already offered us a dialogical way of living a life and changing the world. Another thing that the dominant group uses to divide people is the insecurities that people have internalized. Right? Remember, we had talked about it in chapter 1, discussion of the fear of freedom. Because what people internalize is not just what their place is in the world, but that it is connected to the social order, right? And so it becomes a perilous thing for them to even think of changing the social order, right? Think of like attempts at unionizing, right? When people oppose it, what they are opposing it for is not what the union will accomplish, but what they oppose is, hey, we have it good here. Our employer gives us this, this, and this. Why do you want to unsettle that? It's because our position is so precarious and so dependent on the order that already exists. Even though we know that it's an unjust order, we don't see ourselves trying to challenge that and change that, right? And that will come through solidarity with others. So this is what he's explaining so far, and this video or conversation, in my humble opinion, has covered the second registers now, divide and rule. So I encourage you to watch it with the previous video, part 7, that was also on divide and rule, and then I'll come back and discuss the rest of the chapter. As always, my views are not all exhaustive. I don't have all the knowledge. These conversations are just meant to share my views with you and then hope that you'll go on to read the book and form your own opinions. That's it. Thank you so much, and as always, peace and love.